It feels like every time you turn on the news or look at social media, bam, there's another election poll staring you in the face. And they all seem to be saying something different, right? It's enough to make you wonder, can we trust any of these things? Are these polls giving us the real picture or just adding to the noise? So today, we're doing a deep dive to try and figure that out. We're going straight to the source, talking to the people behind those polls to understand what's really going on in the 2024 race. And we've got two absolute heavyweights in the polling world joining us for this, John Anzalone and Greg Strimple. Now, John Anzalone, he's a big name in Democratic circles, worked with everyone from Biden to Obama. And Greg Strimple, well, he's a Republican strategist, been advising top Republicans like McCain and Christie for years.
So we're getting perspectives from both sides of the aisle, which should give us a really well-rounded view.
Definitely. And what they have to, well, it might surprise you. Like, there was this one Fox News poll that revealed a really unexpected trend in how voters are viewing this election. We'll unpack that a bit later on. But here's another interesting thing. There's this whole Kamala Harris is going to win perception going around, and it's causing some ripples, particularly among Republicans, actually. But before we jumped into all that, I think we need to tackle the elephant, or should I say, the donkey in the room. With all these polls flying around, can we even trust any of them?
Well, even veteran pollsters like John Anzalone are expressing some, let's say, reservations. He actually used the term shitty polls to describe some of what we're seeing out there, so he's not holding back.
Wow, shitty polls. That's pretty blunt. So how do we separate those shitty polls from the ones that are actually giving us good information?
Both Anzalone and Strimple agree that it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
There are just so many polls out there now, and the methods they use vary wildly. Plus, it's harder than you might think to reach certain groups of voters. Like, Strimple brought up how tricky it is to get responses from hardcore Trump supporters through online surveys.
That's surprising. You'd think in this day and age, online would be the easiest way to reach anyone.
Right. But Strimple explained that the Republicans who tend to respond to online surveys, they're more often what he calls country club Republicans. They're not necessarily representative of the diehard Trump base.
So it's not just about how many people you reach, but who those people actually are. The quality, not just the quantity.
Exactly. And this leads to another crucial point about polls. We have to remember the undecideds. They often get overlooked, but they can have a huge impact, especially in a close race. Both Anzalone and Strimple emphasize how important it is to understand what motivates these undecided voters.
Makes sense. They could swing the whole election. Okay, so for those of us who aren't polling experts, how do we navigate this maze of polls? How do we figure out which ones are reliable and which ones are, well, shitty?
Anzalone suggests focusing on a smaller number of aggregators, but not just any aggregators.
Right, because there are tons of those too.
Exactly. He's really urging people to look at how these aggregators choose which polls to include.
So it's about the aggregators being selective, not just hoovering up every poll they can find.
Right, like, do they prioritize something called multimodal methodology? It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means they use a mix of phone surveys, online surveys, even text message surveys to gather their data.
So they're not just relying on one method, they're casting a wider net.
Exactly. Anzalone also stressed the importance of something called likely voter screens.
Likely voter screens.
Yeah, it's a way to filter out people who are unlikely to actually vote.
So they're trying to make sure they're talking to people who are actually going to cast a ballot.
Exactly. And very importantly, do those aggregators prioritize polls that utilize voter files?
So it's like a checklist for smart polling, multimodal methodology, likely voter screens, voter files. I'm taking notes. We've been talking about the challenges of polling, but are there any bright spots? Are there any polls or trends that our experts found particularly revealing?
There are, and this is where things get really interesting. Both Anzalone and Strimple agree that this election hinges on a few key dynamics, and they might surprise you.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What are these under-the-radar dynamics that are shaping the race?
One thing that really jumped out at both Anzalone and Strimple is how stable this race has been. Like, even with all the crazy stuff happening, assassination attempts, economic turmoil, you name it, the polls have barely budged.
Huh. It's like the electorate is just numb to the chaos at this point.
It's wild, right? But here's the thing. What Anzalone and Strimple really hammered home is that this election is all about change.
Change?
Yeah, but it's not as simple as it sounds. Each candidate represents a different vision of change, and the voters are trying to figure out which direction they want to go in.
So it's not just about the economy, healthcare, the usual hot-button issues.
It's bigger than that. It's about the whole direction of the country. You've got Trump. He's running on a platform of change from the Biden-Harris administration. He's appealing to those voters who feel like things have gone off the rails and want to go back to how things were before.
Back to make America great again.
Exactly. Then you've got Harris. She's also promising change, but her version is about moving forward from the Trump era. She's trying to connect with voters who are tired of the drama, the scandals, the division.
Two very different visions of change. So it sounds like understanding the hopes and fears of, say, a suburban woman in Michigan is more important than dissecting any policy speech.
You might be onto something there. And within this whole change narrative, there are a few key demographics that really stand out. Both Anzalone and Strimple pointed to the gender gap in this election. It's huge, and it's persistent. Strimple specifically called out independent suburban women as a group to watch very closely.
Yeah, the gender gap is something we're seeing reflected in pretty much every poll.
It's significant, and it cuts across all sorts of demographics. These women, they're turned off by Trump's behavior, his rhetoric, but they're also worried about the economy. So they're caught in the middle.
Trying to decide which version of change aligns more with their values.
Exactly, and that's why both campaigns are pouring so much time and energy into understanding these voters.
They're the key to winning this election. So let's talk about these voters, these persuadable voters. Who are they? What motivates them?
Both Anzalone and Strimple offered some interesting insights. They tend to be younger, more likely to be female, and disproportionately white and non-college educated.
You know, one thing that struck me was the point about Latino voters, how they're not as homogenous a group as people might think.
Absolutely. Anzalone actually told a story about his own grandparents. They were Sicilian immigrants, and all they wanted was to be seen as American.
They wanted to assimilate.
Exactly. And Anzalone's point was that we tend to lump all Latinos together when in reality their political views are incredibly diverse. It depends on things like generation, how assimilated they are, their personal experiences, all sorts of factors.
Right. It's a good reminder not to make assumptions about entire groups of people. So we've got these persuadable voters, many of whom are women, a good chunk of whom are Latino. Where do third-party candidates fit into all of this?
That's where things get even more complicated. Strimple made a really interesting observation about voters who can't stand Trump's personality. But they're also really worried about the economy.
So they might be fiscally conservative, but not necessarily socially conservative.
Exactly. And those voters, they might be drawn to a third-party candidate who speaks to their economic concerns more directly.
It's like a political thriller, trying to figure out which way these voters will swing. And speaking of swinging, we can't forget about the electoral map itself. That Cook Political Report survey you mentioned earlier, the one showing a shift towards Harris in some key swing states, that's got to be making things interesting.
It definitely is. And some of those shifts are pretty unexpected. Take Michigan, for example. A lot of people had written it off as solidly blue. But now it looks like it could go either way.
Yeah, that Michigan result was a real eye-opener. What's making it so volatile?
Well, Michigan's a microcosm of a lot of the dynamics we've been talking about. It's got a large white working class population, a lot of them tied to the auto industry. They're feeling the economic squeeze, so they might be receptive to Trump's message on jobs and trade.
And then there's that large Arab American population, particularly around Dearborn.
Right, that's a voting bloc that could swing the election either way.
Mm.
And on top of all that, you've got the electric vehicle issue. Trump's really turned that into a wedge issue, playing on those anxieties about job losses in the traditional auto industry.
It's fascinating how all these factors are coming together to make Michigan such a toss-up. What about the Sun Belt? Is it still the Republican stronghold that some people make it out to be? The Sun Belt is interesting for sure. Anzalone seems to think Georgia is poised to flip blue, but even he admits that North Carolina is looking pretty red.
And we can't forget about Nevada. Strimple sees that one as swinging back towards Harris. This electoral map is like a constantly shifting puzzle.
It's making my head spin trying to keep track of it all. But hold on, there's another layer to this whole election that we haven't even touched on yet. Ticket splitting.
Ah, yes. Anzalone actually predicts that we might see a bit of a resurgence in ticket splitting this time around. Voters might choose a Democrat for president, but then go with Republicans for other offices like Congress.
So they might be open to a Harris presidency, but still want a Republican Congress as a check on her power.
Exactly. It's a way for voters to hedge their bets, make sure neither party has too much control. And Strimple thinks this kind of thinking could actually benefit Republicans down ballot. His argument is that voters might be thinking, okay, we'll give Harris a shot, but we want the Republicans there to keep her in line.
So many moving parts, it's like a political chess match out there. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We dug into the messy world of election polling, learned about the good, the bad, and the shitty, and how important it is to be critical consumers of all that data.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly trust every poll that pops up on our screens.
We also explored the deeper currents driving this election, how it's not just about the issues, but about these competing visions of change. And of course, we can't forget about those persuadable voters, the ones who could swing the whole election.
The wild cards.
Exactly. And finally, we took a whirlwind tour of the electoral map, trying to make sense of all the twists and turns. This has been an incredible conversation, really eye-opening. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Here's something to chew on. If we do see this resurgence in ticket splitting, with voters choosing a Democrat for president and more Republicans in Congress, what does that say about the state of our democracy? Is it a sign of a healthy system, with voters actively seeking balance? Or is it a symptom of something more troubling, a deeper division that's making it harder and harder to govern?
That's a question worth pondering, for sure. It seems like we're in for a wild ride these next few months, with an election that could be one for the history books. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.